Good evening, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well. Hope everyone has had a good week. We will continue tonight in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 after just a little bit of a review of the first 8 verses, and we'll be taking up with verse 9 in your material. It is on page 14, about halfway down. So I'll give everyone a minute to be turning and getting everything there. But chapter 3, as I looked over this material and was putting it together this year, I've worked on it all year. Chapter 3 to me seems to be a very key chapter, possibly the most important chapter in the book as far as helping us to understand where he starts from and how he's going to get to his conclusion at the end of the book, that our purpose for existing, our purpose for being created, is to have the utmost respect or fear God and keep His commandments. That's why He made us. He didn't purpose that for animals. He didn't make them for that reason. And everything, as I pointed out, everything that was made for man, in the sense that, don't take this wrong, but it's not that the animals were created to help us obey God, but they have a function. Man was put over everything. Part of his activity or his work or his task involves interaction with animals. I mean, why else would you say, let's just take one animal. Why did God create a dog? Why has a dog come to be referred to as our best friend? Why? What about pets? There are but while that's not the main subject of our study, why did God make animals? There is some reason. There is obviously, it wasn't for our harm, but animals were made by God. You ever thought about why? What their purpose is? And these things kind of factor in the relationships, leaving the animal realm. God created relationships. He made us male and female. What did He intend for a male and female to do? There's a relationship that God instituted, marriage. Why? Why didn't God just purpose for people to be single all their life? He made us with desires, with longings, with emotions, but He also fixed or appointed and arranged for those things to be, those needs to be met and fulfilled. God meant for us to have joy in life. This is some of the things that He's talking about here in this book. There are pleasures that we can have. We are to acknowledge God in those things. But is that all we're here for? Just have pleasure. This is where he's bringing this in, but he says, we're not just here to frolic around. We're not just here to groom our pets and take them to pet shows. They give us fulfillment, they give us joy, they give us pleasure. A lot of things do. But what's our purpose in life? And the end of the book. So we'll get into that, and this kind of, I'm trying to again set the stage for tonight's class. I thought we would finish chapter 3. We may not, but if I don't hush, I know we won't. Okay, the first 8 verses that we read last Sunday, of course, verse 1 opened up that there's an appointed time for everything. He mentions that again. There's a time for every matter under heaven, and we basically explored that. One of the key things that I think you should bake in your notes to remember from these first 8 verses is, in regard to these set or appointed times, who set these things? Us or God? So whatever there's a time for this, there's a time for that. They are fixed by God. And keep in mind that while they are for us and God uses us, for example, let's take the one in verse 2, time to give birth, a time to die. The latter part of the verse, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. We talked about, noticed some verses that had reference to that. What does God uproot and what does God plant? What are some verses that reflected that? What kind of planting and uprooting has God done, so to speak, from day one?
When you have the rise and fall of empires.
Nations. So when we're reading here of these things, that there's a time for this and a time for that, and these are things that God does. God determined when the iniquity of the Amorites had reached its brim. And what did He do? He took care of that. And there was a time at that point that He began to move to the next stage in fulfilling His oath to Abraham. That time had come almost 500 years after God spoke those words to Abraham. And so God gave birth. God caused a birth. In verse 2, a time to give birth. If we just if we take the Scriptures literally and literally only, our initial take on this is there's a time when you're going to have a baby. I hope you see this is not what the author is having reference to. There is a time when God says it's time for something to be born. It may be, well, just to use the example that we had for the Amorites, God, in Genesis chapter 12, He mentioned that the threefold promise to Abraham, what was the first of those 3 promises? He wanted to make of you a great. God was going to cause a birth. He was going to give birth to a nation through Abraham. Now, yes, did that involve a physical birth of Sarah giving birth? Yes, there's a time for birth. But you understand, Sarah's birth had a bigger fulfillment, a bigger purpose. And the time for Sarah to give birth was in connection with the iniquity of the Amorites 400 and some years earlier. So there are times and things that God has set in His time frame of when things were going to happen. And nothing that man could do would change that. Whether man was obedient, whether man was disobedient. When God determined the Amorites' iniquity is full. There were disobedient people. There were obedient people. But God appointed when this was going to happen. So these appointed times are what we're talking about, or what we talked about. So just to understand that all of these things in verses 2 through 8 have a spiritual connection to God fulfilling His eternal purpose. I've asked in just about every setting because it's applicable. When Adam and Eve sinned back in Eden, why did Jesus come die on the cross then? Why did God wait? It wasn't the appointed time. And so in the New Testament, we read in the book of Romans and in the book of Galatians, 2 verses that mention in due season Christ died for the ungodly. And in Galatians, it says in Galatians, I believe chapter 4 and verse 4, I'm not sure I'm quoting that right, when the fullness of times had arrived, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law. There was a time to be born. That's what he's having reference to here in Ecclesiastes. But that fullness of time was not in the Garden of Eden. It wasn't in the days of Noah. It wasn't in the days of Abraham. God had appointed and fixed when this would come. And accordingly, we read how many times in the Gospels, in the 4 Gospels, Jason, you might have some idea, how many times do we read that the time is at hand, the time is at hand, the time is near? What was that having reference to? This fullness of time. Because Jesus, yes, He had been born, but as Jesus said, Jesus had been born to die, so to speak. And so in the Gospels, it's not having reference, it's time for Him to be born. He has been born. But the time is at hand, the time is near. That was having reference to Jesus fulfilling His earthly ministry. He came to die. That was foreordained, according to the Apostle Peter in the first Gospel sermon. He was foreknown and He was foreordained to die for our sins. And so all these appointed times were with a view to God fulfilling His eternal purpose. So that kind of sums up the first 8 verses. Now, as we move on to the remainder of the chapter, one thing that I want to point out, and I probably should have pointed this out earlier and even put it in the material, but when you're doing a contextual study, always look for questions in the text. If there is a question, ask, okay? Find the answer to that question, unless it's a rhetorical question. Because that is going to point you to what the subject is of that context. Did anyone in reading this chapter know right off the top of your hand how many questions are asked in chapter 3?
The time to die, we look at that as ourselves and think that God has preordained when each person life is going to end, or is that just mean something else?
We had a verse on that, Psalm chapter 74 and verse 12. Wendell. So yes, we'll answer that. No, excuse me, not Psalm. In Acts, David, when he had fulfilled his purpose for which God made him king, died. Okay? So, yes, we all have purpose here. And we are to live our life to fulfill the purpose for which God made us. We all have that same purpose. I'm here to try to learn to be reconciled to God. And then from that point on, I'm to try to help others discover what I have found. If I'm living my life not doing that, we closed last week with a passage from the book of Romans, chapter 9, verses 21 through 23, where God talked about vessels of wrath and vessels of mercy, okay? In that context there in Romans chapter 9, God talked about He is the potter, people are clay, and God can create something, and if He doesn't like it, He can destroy it and make something new, can't He? So Pharaoh was a vessel of wrath in God's hand because Pharaoh would not submit to God's or Jehovah's power. I am God, let my people go. And Pharaoh kept saying, well, I will, but then he would renege on it. So Pharaoh was a vessel of wrath. But God used him, didn't He? He said, I brought you into power to show my power in destroying you. So there was a time. So this relates in, so Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus from Michael Ray's class on Israel Returns Home, they were vessels of wrath in God's hand. They were evil monarchs, but God used them to fulfill His promise that I will keep a remnant spared. And so we saw the kindness. When God was finished with Pharaoh, what did He do to Pharaoh? Destroyed him, didn't He? The Egyptians, they were all drowned. He kept His people alive, but how many of those people died throughout their existence? Because they murmured, they whispered, they complained, they griped, they served other gods. They did not fulfill their purpose for which God made them into a nation. He said, I want you to be a peculiar people. So God was very long-suffering, but ultimately, when God said, you have fulfilled all that I purposed for you to do, yes, they died. And I believe, Wendell, that is exactly what happens with you and I. We have an appointed time. We had several passages here. These passages here, God hath appointed the bounds for people. So yes, it's a long answer to your question, but I wanted to have it not just yes without clarifying why, but yes, I believe we all are here for a designated time, and I know we're here for a designated purpose. My dad used to use the word fit in a negative sense, that if somebody wasn't doing anything worthwhile, he would say, what are they fit for? Why do I need to continue living if I'm going to be nothing but a hindrance to people coming to the Lord? What use am I? But can God use me to maybe bring someone to repentance even though I'm disobedient? Well, you know He did Pharaoh. I know He did Nebuchadnezzar. Job's wife. Job was a godly man, wasn't he? What about his wife? What did God do to her? What do we read of Job's wife? Anything happened to her? Big question mark. Was she a source of encouragement to Job or a source of discouragement? Well, why didn't God take her out of just take her out of the picture? Job certainly didn't need that. Satan had already inflicted him. But you got Job's wife. You got Lot's wife. You got Ahab. Why were these people like Ahab allowed to even go for periods of time before God brought their life to an end. God appointed. There's a lot of things that would have been influenced that's not necessarily recorded in the Bible. You've got, well, I know one thing for many years I struggled with. David's sin with Bathsheba and his cover-up, which involved a murder, didn't it? Yet here was a man named Uzzah. What was his only sin? And that man died. But David didn't. And David, adultery, murder. Not just of Uriah. To make sure that Uriah was murdered, how many other innocent men was put to the front of the battle? And they all died to make sure that David's adultery was covered up. God never killed David, but he struck Uriah dead on the spot. Was God just? He certainly was. But there's things I don't know. I don't need to know. If I needed to know them, God would have put more information in there. Why did God strike Uriah? And yet David is described as a man after my own heart. So, and I bring that into this discussion because this question is asked many times in Ecclesiastes. I don't understand the injustice that goes on. People struggle with injustice. Sometimes they blame God. Why does God allow evil to continue? If there is a God, why doesn't He do something about it? I was talking to Kyle about it since he preached on it. And I said, you know, people who question the existence of God, that if there is a God, why doesn't He do something about the evil? You know, if because God does not treat evil like He treated Uriah, because He doesn't deal with evil quickly, if that means God doesn't exist, why don't you do something about evil? Why don't you stop evil? You can't, can you? Does that mean you don't exist? Just because evil is not dealt with on our time frame doesn't mean God's not dealing with it. This is part of the injustice that the author is dealing with. Now, we know that God is dealing with injustice, that God is going to judge the righteous and the wicked, verse 17. And that God is somewhat dealing with it right now. But we also know part of God's nature is that He is long-suffering and patient. And what are we to understand about the patience of God, the long-suffering of God, according to 2 Peter 3 and verse 9? It's designed to bring wicked men to repentance. God's dealing with them. God's dealing with them in this life. He's bringing judgment on people in this life because life is vanity for people who live without acknowledging God and His ways. They're going to have, as past generations used to say, they're going to have a rough road to hoe in life. Their life is going to be just filled with sorrow and one disappointment after the other. And they go on and they blame everybody but themselves. God says this is the life you're going to have when you live without acknowledging me. You're going to try to be happy in that miserable life. You're never going to be happy. But there's a way to be happy. So, Wendell, I hope that answers your question sufficiently.
That brings another question to mind. I don't mean
Bring it up. No. Any,
Sometimes babies are by in birth. It's hard to understand the purpose.
mm-hmm.
Of that particular birth, when the
Yes.
death takes place almost immediately,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe even sometime before birth.
And He has put eternity in our heart, but not so that we know from beginning to end. Why do these things happen? That's just happened this week, hasn't it, within our congregation? There's been a death. There's people that will tell you, well, just like Job, well, the parents must be in sin and God's punished them. Is that so? Bad things happen to innocent people. A person goes out and starts drinking and becomes very drunk, gets behind the wheel of a car, takes off down the road and hits another car, people that are stone sober, and it kills them. Why does God allow that to happen? That's the question that's asked. We know better than to ask, why did God allow that? God has given us wisdom. Wise people understand the injustices and the inequities in life, the death, a stillborn. It was answered in chapter 1. Why does vanity? Why was this world subjected to vanity, class? Because of sin. Adam and Eve sinned. Did it have anything to do with Abel's death? It sure did. It sure did. And we are affected by Adam and Eve's choice to listen to Satan. We do the same thing. So the inequities of life and all the work and labor that man is engaged in without acknowledging, this could be fixed. If we would quit disobeying God and submit to His will, our lives could be turned around. Our lives could be turned around. Why don't people do that? And you try to talk to them, and you're met with, "You're judging me." Why do people do that? The author here looked about, and he saw the misery that people were living in. And he said, what they're doing, it's so vain, it's so useless, it's so worthless. So, back to our discussion. Whenever there are questions in a text, always make a note of that and try to find the answer within the text or in a remote text. How many questions were in this chapter? You've got this one in verse 9, verse 21, and verse 22. There are 3 questions in this chapter. They hold the key to understanding what else is said. So we won't be getting to verses 21 and 22 tonight, but since I brought it to your attention, be looking for those as well as how it's related to this question. Because this question in verse 9 is kind of summarizing verses 2 through 8. These appointed times that God has meant for us to do things, what benefit is there to us for it? This is the labors that he's having reference to. There's a time to die, a time to be born, a time to heal, a time That's the labors. That is, this is tied, verse 9, the question is linked to verses 2 through 8. Also, in a context, look for key verses that will define, again, the subject under consideration. And there are two key verses that I took note of in this chapter. One is verse 14, the other one is verse 18. Whatever he's talking about, from verse 9 on through verse 22, those two verses tell us why these things happen. So I hope you'll make those, add those into your notes, okay? We'll get to verse 14 here in a minute, but verses 2 through 8, these appointed times, these are things that God acts. And so notice here in verse 10, I have seen the task which God has given the sons of mankind with which to occupy themselves. What am I to do with my life here under the sun? Take note, I have been given a work. This is my purpose. And God has, again, God, verse 11, He has made everything appropriate in its time. Who has done this? God has. God has also set eternity in man's heart without the possibility, and this is what we was talking about, Wendell, without the possibility that we can find out the work which God has done from beginning to end. Anyone not understand what that verse is saying, there, verse 11? If you were to put it in your own words, what does it mean God has put eternity in your heart? What do you understand that to be saying?
Humans in general have this desire for something greater than themselves. There's something, an inborn desire. We know that there's something more than just what we have and what we are.
We are, anytime someone says, I know the secret to, man, what we perk up. I know what happens beyond. We are just drawn to the unknown. We want to know about our existence, don't we? We want to know about those that have left us, be it a parent, be it a stranger. Where are they? What's their status? We want to know that. Why? Because God made us with that capability of wanting to know. Where did I come from? Where am I going? And how will I get there? That's why God made us capable of being communicated to and made us capable of communicating with one another. Could you imagine life when nobody could understand anybody else? Or being incapable of communicating, period. Whether by gestures. Could you imagine? Gives you some small glimpse back in Genesis 11. When God stopped the building of the Tower of Babel, how did He do it? And as a result, boy, they just hung around, started hugging each other. What did they do? Ironically, in Acts 2, God used many languages to bring people together because He caused them to understand it. So these are some things, let's go on. He says, I know that there is nothing better for them, that is mankind, than to rejoice and do good in their lifetime. This is what we should do. We should enjoy our lifetime. Moreover, I know that there's nothing better than for every person who eats and drinks to see good in all his labor. What is that? That's a gift from God. If God hadn't so purposed that, we couldn't do it. We wouldn't enjoy nothing. The fact that we can enjoy and do good, that's a gift from God. And as we live life, of course, as they say, I'm preaching to the choir here, we know that, don't we? We know to acknowledge God. We are reminded of that every time we assemble. That's a blessing from God. And he goes on to say, I also know that everything God does, what about it? It will remain forever. There is nothing to add to it, and there's nothing to take from it. And God has so worked, for what reason, class? What kind of fear are we talking about? God has so set these appointed times in verses 2 through 8. Here is why I say verse 14 is a key verse. This is why God has so worked that we might fear Him. Now, what does the end of the book, Ecclesiastes, say? Man's whole duty is to do what? See, he's leading us up to the end of the book. Now, that verse there, Brother Wendell, to get back to what we discussed, God has so worked. Psalms chapter 74 and verse 12, we noticed this last week. David said, God is my king from of old, who works deeds of deliverance in the midst of the earth. This is what God's doing. He is still at work trying to accomplish salvation in mankind. Now, He does that through people, His people. And that's our task. That's our job. That's why God redeemed us. Now, if I'm not going to be spending my life trying to help people get saved, either in my example, doesn't mean I got to stand in the pulpit, but I'm to let my light shine. I'm to be salt. If I'm not doing that, then I'm working against God. Does that mean God's not going to be able to save anybody? Yes, He can. And He will use me. He will say, don't follow Roger's example. As we go on, that which is what has already been, and that which will be has already been. So here's two things that's already been. That which is and that which has been, or that which will be. It's already been, and God seeks what has passed by. This is a key verse. This is a key verse, and we're going to have some questions that deal with that. I'm going to readdress that in just a moment, okay? Because we need to understand what that's saying. But just a couple of questions in review. Does man's disregard for his assigned task from God, that was mentioned in verse 10, does it have any effect upon these appointed times of God? No, it doesn't. But, number two, does man's disregard of his assigned task from God have any effect upon himself? Yes, it does. Any question on that? And again, according to verse 14, the key verse, what's the reason for these appointed times? Why did God fix things the way that He did? So that people will do what? That's the reason for these appointed times. Any comments? Any questions? Anything you don't understand? Okay, let's address this verse 15. It said, that which is what has already been, and that which will be has already been, and God seeks what has passed by. Now, depending upon what version you use, I really struggle with trying to understand what this meant, especially the end of the verse. God seeks what has passed by according to the context and what was said elsewhere. This phrase, God seeks what has passed by. These are two keys. The word seeks here, it means God requires. And the phrase passed by means driven away. This fits the context. What has man done that caused the futility to come into existence? All right, so man has driven away what God purposed for him to do. He's cast that out of his life, hasn't he? So that which has already been, which is what man's done, it's what will be, it's what, okay? God requires or expects man to pursue the very thing man has driven away or cast away from his life. That's what this phrase means. God ordained for man to live a certain way. He's been given the task of pursuing these appointed things that we read about in verses 2 through 8. They're fixed and they're not going to change. I may drive them out of my life and not do that with my life. But God's not going to change. He still says, this is what I purposed for you to do. As I looked at it, that's what I have, and looking at everything I had time to look at this year. This is what this means, and that does fit what we've discussed about so far. Did any of you all come up with anything else? Or if you want to look at it further between now and Sunday, what that phrase means here in the latter part of verse 15, do so, and we'll take up with that. Anyone not understand my comments here? Disagree? I welcome your feedback. If you don't, to my, as far as I can tell, this fits this context. This is what caused the world to be subjected to vanity. Man's disobeyed. That's all I'm saying in this. Man's driven away obedience. He wants no part of it. But God says that's still what I purposed. My purpose for you is never going to change. Okay? All right. Lord's willing, Sunday we'll take up with verse 16 if you want to mark that in your lesson. And if you have any question about what we covered tonight, I hope this is clear. I hope you're enjoying the class. This is a contextual approach to the book of Ecclesiastes. It's how I study all my sermons, the articles in the newspaper, in the bulletin. It's kind of how I was taught. I do things contextually. I'll grant you they're not flamboyant. Contextual study is not flamboyant, and a lot of people it's boring. But it deals with questions, and it makes you think. And that's what God meant for us to do. Why did He give us a brain? Use it or lose it. Okay? Thank you all so much. Okay, we'll take up with verse 16, Lord's willing, Sunday.